A millionaire has his daughters saved by a garbage man on a rainy afternoon. When he offers a reward, he receives an unusual request that changes his life. An investigation reveals that their family's fates are intertwined. The wealthy man will have to choose between power and justice. The sky over Chicago had never seemed as gray as it did that March afternoon. Heavy clouds poured relentless rain over the city, creating an almost cinematic backdrop for what was about to unfold. In the back seat of a brand new Mercedes, Emily and Sophia Thompson, daughters of the powerful businessman Richard Thompson, were discussing the preparations for Sophia's sweet 16 party, the youngest of the two. "Dad, you promised we could have the party at the Plaza Hotel," insisted Sophia, her brown eyes gleaming with anticipation as she adjusted her perfectly straightened dark hair. "All my friends are expecting it." Emily, 2 years older than her, sister, rolled her eyes while frantically typing on her phone. "Sophia, don't you think you're overdoing it? Laura's party was amazing and it was right here in Chicago." Richard kept his eyes fixed on his laptop screen, only partially engaged in his daughter's conversation. As the CEO of Thompson Enterprises, one of the largest real estate companies in the country, he was used to juggling multiple demands at once. However, the discussion about the party was starting to demand his attention. "Girls, can we settle this at home? I'm trying to finalize a presentation for the board meeting tomorrow," he interjected, his voice a mix of affection and exhaustion. It was at that moment that everything happened. The driver had to brake sharply when a car ahead skidded on the wet road. The Mercedes slid dangerously, spinning on the busy avenue. The girls' screams echoed inside the vehicle as papers and phones flew around the car. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. A man came running down the sidewalk, moving with surprising agility. In a matter of seconds, he managed to open the locked car door and pull Emily and Sophia out, moments before another vehicle collided with the side of the car, exactly where the girls had been sitting. "Are you okay?" asked the man, his hoarse voice filled with concern as he shielded the girls from the rain with his own worn-out coat. His deep, kind green eyes conveyed a comforting calm amidst the chaos. Richard, who had managed to get out of the car on the other side with the driver's help, ran to his daughters. Seeing them safe, he hugged them tightly, tears mixing with the rain that still fell. Only then did he turn to the man who had saved his daughters. I don't know how to thank you," Richard stammered, still trembling. "You saved my daughters. Please let me repay you in some way." The man, who introduced himself as Joseph Charles Smith, was around 50 years old with graying hair and dressed in simple but clean and well-kept clothes. His weathered face carried a dignity that caught Richard's attention. "There's no need to thank me, sir. Anyone would have done the same," Joseph Charles replied simply, as he helped gather the belongings scattered across the pavement. Richard, accustomed to solving everything with money, was already pulling out his checkbook. "I insist. You can't imagine the value of what you did today. Please accept a reward." It was then that something unexpected happened. Joseph Charles raised his hand, politely declining the check Richard was trying to hand him. His green eyes locked onto the businessman's with a disconcerting intensity. "If you truly want to thank me, I have a different proposal," Joseph Charles said, his voice calm but firm. "Spend a day living my reality. Just one day. That is worth more than any amount of money." The unusual request caught Richard completely off guard. Emily and Sophia, who had been silently observing the scene, exchanged curious glances. The businessman hesitated, his mind already searching for a polite way to decline the absurd proposal. "Dad," Emily interjected, her voice still shaky from the recent ordeal, "I think we should accept. He saved our lives." Sophia, who was usually more concerned with trivial matters, surprised everyone by agreeing with her sister. "It's true, Dad. We could try to understand how other people live, even if it's just for a day." Richard looked at his daughters, then at Joseph Charles, who remained there, serene under the rain that was beginning to let up. Something about the dignity of that man, the simplicity of his request, and the surprising reaction of his daughters made him reconsider his automatic response. "All right," he finally replied, still uncertain about his decision. "When and where?" Joseph Charles smiled for the first time, a smile that lit up his tired face. "Tomorrow at 6 in the morning. I can send you the address by message." As they exchanged contacts, Richard couldn't imagine that this seemingly simple moment was about to trigger a series of events that would completely transform his life and the lives of everyone around him. The rain had finally stopped, but the clouds in Chicago's sky seemed to foreshadow that a greater storm was just beginning. That same night, as the city recovered from the storm, Richard Thompson paced restlessly through the halls of his Beverly Hills mansion. The clock read 11:47 p.m., and he was still wearing the same soaked suit from the accident. In the living room, his daughters slept embraced on the couch, exhausted from the afternoon scare, while the TV played some reality show at a low volume. "You should rest too," suggested Mary, the housekeeper who had worked with the family for 2 decades. "It's been a tough day for everyone." Richard nodded distractedly, his thoughts still stuck on the moment Joseph Charles had refused the check. In 20 years of leading Thompson Enterprises, he had never encountered someone who preferred time over money. The man's proposal intrigued him and at the same time deeply irritated him. His phone vibrated for the 10th time that hour. It was Edward Miller, his right-hand man at the company, probably concerned about his absence from the preparatory meeting for the next day's presentation. Richard took a deep breath and answered. "Richard, where have you been? We've got a situation here." Edward's voice sounded tense. "The board is questioning the numbers for the new village project. We need to revise the presentation now." "Edward, my daughter's almost had an accident today," Richard replied, his voice betraying the accumulated exhaustion. "And tomorrow, I won't be able to attend the board meeting." A heavy silence followed on the other end of the line. "What? Do you mean you won't attend?" "Richard, have you lost your mind? It's the most important meeting of the quarter." For the first time in years, Richard felt uncomfortable with the pressure of work. The words of Joseph Charles echoed in his mind. "Spend a day living my reality." "Edward, you can lead the meeting. The numbers are solid, and you know the project." "As well as I do," he replied with a firmness that surprised even himself. "Is this because of that guy who helped your daughters? Richard, be rational. Send him a check and be done with it. You can't risk all our work for a moment of philanthropy." The word philanthropy sounded like an insult. Richard looked at his sleeping daughters and remembered the serene gaze of Joseph Charles. "It's not philanthropy, Edward. It's a debt of honor." Before his vice president could protest again, Richard ended the call. He walked over to the couch and gently adjusted the blanket over Emily and Sophia. That's when he noticed his eldest daughter was actually awake. "Dad," Emily whispered. Careful not to wake her sister. "Are you really going to do this tomorrow?" Richard sat down in the armchair next to the couch. "Do you think I'm crazy too?" Emily smiled, a surprisingly mature smile for her 18 years. "I think you're doing the right thing, for the right reason, for the first time in a long time." His daughter's words hit him with unexpected force. When had Emily become so observant, so wise? How many moments of his daughters' lives had he missed while building his empire? "You know what impressed me the most about Mr. Joseph Charles?" Emily continued, her eyes shining in the dim light of the room. "The way he looked at us, not as Richard Thompson's daughters, but as 2 people who needed help." Richard felt a lump in his throat. He stood up and walked to the window, gazing at the city lights. Chicago never slept, much like the thoughts now tormenting him. His phone vibrated, again this time with a message from Joseph Charles. "Address 237 Acacia Street, Spring Garden. 6 a.m. Come as who you really are, not as who you think you should be." The businessman reread the message several times, intrigued by those last words. In his closet, among hundreds of Italian suits, he found an old pair of jeans and a polo shirt he barely remembered buying. He set them aside for the next day, feeling strangely nervous, like a student on the eve of an important exam. In the kitchen, Mary was preparing tea to help him sleep. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" she asked, handing him the steaming cup. "Not exactly," admitted Richard, taking a sip of chamomile tea. "But something tells me I need to do this. For them," he gestured toward his daughters, "and maybe for myself." The clock in the living room struck midnight, marking the start of a new day. In a few hours, Richard Thompson, the powerful CEO of Thompson Enterprises, would step into Uncharted territory. Not just a different neighborhood in the city, but a world entirely foreign to his reality of privilege and power. As he prepared for bed, he couldn't imagine that the real challenge wouldn't be living a day in Joseph Charles's reality. The real challenge would be returning to his own reality after encountering a truth that would forever change his perspective on the value of things, of people, and most importantly of himself. The sun hadn't yet risen when Richard parked his Porsche Cayenne on Acacia Street. The GPS had guided him through increasingly narrow and poorly maintained streets to that address in Spring Garden, an area he had never imagined visiting. He checked the number again, 237. The house was small, with exposed brick walls and a well-kept little garden where a few flowers bravely resisted the morning chill. Joseph Charles was already waiting at the gate, wearing an orange sanitation worker's uniform and holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. His calm smile contrasted with Richard's poorly concealed nervousness. "Good morning, Mr. Richard," greeted Joseph Charles, handing him one of the cups. "I thought I might need a coffee before we start." Richard accepted the cup, noticing it was from a simple set with a small chip on the rim. The aroma of the coffee, however, was surprisingly good. "Thank you," he replied, trying to hide his discomfort with the situation. "Come in, please. I want to introduce you to someone before we head to work," said Joseph Charles, guiding him through a small side hallway. The interior of the house was modest but impeccably organized. In the living room, which also served as a dining area, a young woman of about 20 was sitting in a wheelchair reading a book under the light of a lamp. Her eyes, identical to her father's, lit up when she saw the visitors. "Amanda, this is Mr. Richard Thompson, the father of the girls I told you about. Mr. Thompson, this is my daughter, Amanda." "Nice to meet you," said Amanda with a warm smile. "Dad, don't forget to take your medicine before you leave." Richard observed the interaction between father and daughter with growing interest. There was a sense of complicity, a mutual care that made him think of his own relationship with Emily and Sophia. "Amanda has muscular dystrophy," explained Joseph Charles as he grabbed a bottle of pills from the kitchen. "Diagnosed at 12, but it never stopped her from being at the top of her class. She's studying literature at the public university. Through distance learning," Amanda added with a tone of pride in her voice, "and I'm writing my first novel." Richard felt a lump in his throat. The dignity with which this family faced their challenges left him speechless. Before he could formulate an appropriate response, Joseph Charles checked his watch. "It's time. We need to catch the first bus," he announced, bidding his daughter farewell with a tender kiss on her forehead. The walk to the bus stop was a completely new experience for Richard. The unpaved streets, the modest houses, the workers already moving about at that hour. Everything seemed to come from a parallel universe to his own. "Have you ever ridden a bus?" asked Joseph Charles as they waited in line. Richard shook his head, suddenly feeling embarrassed. The bus arrived packed, and for the first time in his life, the businessman experienced what it meant to compete for space on public transportation. "I've been working at the urban cleaning company for 5 years, explained Joseph Charles as they balanced standing. "Before I had a very different life. I was a civil engineer, you know. I worked on housing projects." Richard felt something familiar in that information, but Joseph Charles quickly changed the subject. "Look over there," he pointed out the A window. "See that abandoned lot? It was supposed to be a model housing complex, an innovative project with green areas, a community center, but something went wrong along the way." The businessman observed the indicated spot, a large fenced lot overgrown with tall grass with some abandoned concrete structures. For some reason, that sight deeply disturbed him. They got off near the city center, where other urban cleaning employees were already gathering. Richard noticed the curious glances in his direction, but Joseph Charles simply introduced him as a friend who's joining us today. "Mr. Richard," said Joseph Charles, handing him an orange uniform identical to his own. "Today you're going to see the city that exists before sunrise. The city no one sees, but without which nothing would work." As he put on the uniform, Richard noticed his hands were trembling slightly. It wasn't fear or disgust, as he might have imagined the day before. It was a different feeling, closer to the anxiety he had felt on his first day as an intern almost 30 years ago. "One last thing," added Joseph Charles with an enigmatic smile. "What you see today might change your life if you're truly willing to see it. Are you ready?" Richard adjusted his protective gloves and nodded, not exactly sure what he was agreeing to. The sun was beginning to rise over Chicago, painting the sky with shades of orange. It was the start not just of a new day, but of a journey that promised to reveal much more than the routine of an ordinary worker. The early hours of that morning were a true ordeal for Richard. The weight of the trash bags, the strong smell of the streets, the constant physical effort. It was all completely different from his usual routine of meetings in air-conditioned rooms. His hands, accustomed only to signing documents and handling tablets, now ached from the heavy labor, even though they were protected by gloves. "You're doing better than I expected," commented Joseph Charles as they collected trash on a downtown street. "A lot of people give up in the first hour." Richard wiped the sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his uniform. "I admit I never imagined how much you all work. How do you manage to do this every day?" Joseph Charles smiled, a smile that carried a mix of pride and resignation. "You get used to it. But you know what's the hardest part? It's not the work itself. It's being invisible." At that moment, as if to illustrate Joseph Charles's point, an executive hurried past them, talking on his phone, nearly knocking over the trash bags they had just collected. He didn't apologize, nor did he even look back. "That could have been me," Richard murmured, feeling a pang of shame. How many times had he himself walked past workers as if they were part of the scenery? As they moved through the city, Joseph Charles shared stories about the places they passed. "See that old building over there? It used to be a textile factory. Now it's going to become a luxury condominium. The families who lived in the tenements in the back were removed last month." Richard felt a familiar discomfort. His company was involved in several similar urban revitalization projects. For the first time, he began to think about the human impact of these transformations. During their lunch break, they sat on a park bench, sharing lunchboxes that Amanda had prepared. Joseph Charles Smith pulled a yellowed envelope from his pocket. "Look what I found the other day while sorting through some old boxes," he said, handing the envelope to Richard Thompson. Inside was an old photo showing a group of engineers standing in front of a model. Richard carefully took the photo. Joseph Charles appeared younger, wearing a suit alongside other professionals. The model displayed a housing project that felt strangely familiar to him. "It was the New Horizon project," explained Joseph Charles, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "My last job as an engineer, it was supposed to be a model housing complex with complete infrastructure. Schools, a health clinic, recreational areas, a project that could truly change lives." "What happened?" asked Richard, growing more intrigued. Joseph Charles carefully put the photo away. "The land was suddenly sold to a major developer. The project was shelved, and hundreds of families who had already signed up were left with nothing. I tried to fight, to seek answers, but doors kept closing one by one." Richard felt his heart race. Something about that story stirred his memories, but before he could ask more questions, they were interrupted by a commotion nearby. A group of teenagers approached, and Richard recognized his daughters Emily and Sophia, accompanied by Amanda, who was in her motorized wheelchair. "Dad!" exclaimed Sophia, running toward him. She suddenly stopped, surprised by his dirty and sweaty appearance in the orange uniform. "Wow, you're really working for real!" Emily approached more reservedly, but her eyes sparkled with admiration. "We came to bring you some snacks. It was Amanda's idea. She told us about her dad's work, and we wanted to see how you were doing." Richard observed the three young women together, his daughters accustomed to every comfort, chatting animatedly with Amanda, who faced daily limitations with such dignity. It was a scene he had never imagined witnessing. "Mr. Richard," called Joseph Charles after the girls had left, "we still have a lot of work ahead, but first, I need to show you a place." They walked a few blocks until they reached an underprivileged community. Joseph Charles pointed to a cluster of precarious shacks perched on a hillside. "Do you know where we are? This is the same land from that photo, The families who couldn't get their homes in the original project ended up occupying the area. Some still hold on to the papers that promised them apartments. Richard felt the weight of that revelation like a punch to the gut. Now he remembered. The New Horizon project had been purchased by Thompson Development 6 years ago through one of its subsidiaries. Just one deal among many that he had approved without a second thought. The afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows over the city. Richard looked at his hands, calloused from just one day of work, and then at Joseph Charles's serene face. He was beginning to understand that this day wasn't just about experiencing a different reality. It was about confronting the consequences of his own actions. That night, dinner at the Thompson mansion remained untouched. Richard sat in his office, surrounded by old folders and documents scattered across the mahogany desk. His eyes frantically scanned the pages of the New Horizon project land acquisition file, trying to understand how he had allowed something like this to happen under his watch. "Dad?" Emily gently knocked on the door. "Can I come in?" Richard looked up from the documents, noticing for the first time that it was past midnight. His eldest daughter entered the office carrying a notebook and sat in the chair across from his desk. "I need to show you something," she said, turning the computer screen toward him. "Sophia and I started a campaign on social media. It's about Amanda and the Spring Garden community." On the screen, a video showed Amanda in her wheelchair, telling her story with surprising eloquence. In the background, images of the community and its residents alternated with old photos of the original project. The video had already garnered over 50,000 views in just a few hours. "We didn't mention the company," explained Emily, biting her lip nervously. "But people are starting to ask questions, a lot of questions." Richard ran his hands over his tired face. "You did the right thing, sweetheart. I'm the one who's been doing everything wrong all these years." At that moment, Sophia burst through the office door holding her phone as if it were a bomb about to explode. "Dad, you need to see this. The story is going viral. People are tagging the company in posts, demanding explanations." Richard's phone began to ring. It was Edward again. "Richard, we have a serious problem. Social media is on fire. That charity day of yours is turning into a PR nightmare. The board is demanding an emergency meeting first thing tomorrow." "Morning." "Great," Richard replied with a firmness that surprised his daughters. "I've been needing to talk to them anyway." After hanging up, he turned his attention back to his daughters. "Girls, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to do could greatly affect our lives. I'm about to confront some powerful people, and the consequences could be serious." "We know, Dad," Emily replied, with a maturity beyond her years. "But for the first time, you're fighting for what's right." Sophia, who usually stayed distant from serious matters, surprised everyone. "You know that party at the Plaza Hotel I really wanted? Forget it. I'd rather use the money to help Amanda and the other families." Richard felt his eyes well up. In a single day, his daughters had shown more wisdom and compassion than he had in decades of business life. The next morning, before the board meeting, Richard made a surprise visit to Spring Garden. He found Joseph Charles preparing for another day of work. "We need to talk," Richard said bluntly. "I found the documents for the New Horizon project. It was my company that bought the land through a subsidiary. I'm sorry." Joseph Charles watched him in silence for a few moments. "I already knew," he finally replied, "from the moment I saw your daughters in that car. But that's not why I asked you to spend a day with me." "No? No? I wanted you to see, with your own eyes, the impact that decisions made in meeting rooms have on real people's lives. And, most importantly, I wanted your daughters to see that there's a world beyond the walls of their mansion." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of those words. "I'll fix this, Joseph Charles. I don't know how yet, but I will." "Be careful," Joseph Charles warned. "Powerful people don't like it when someone threatens their interests." On the way to the office, Richard received a message from Emily. The video about Amanda had surpassed 200,000 views, and a major business magazine wanted to do a story on the case. As he entered the boardroom, Richard found tense and angry faces. Edward was the first to speak. "Richard, do you have any idea of the damage this story is causing?" We need to issue an official statement immediately, minimize the fallout. No, interrupted Richard, his firm voice echoing through the room. No more damage control. It's time to correct mistakes. As he opened his folder of documents on the meeting table, Richard knew he was about to begin the most important battle of his life. It was no longer just about an abandoned housing project or a company in an image crisis. It was about reclaiming his own humanity and showing his daughters that there was always time to do the right thing. The boardroom of Thompson Enterprises, on the 40th floor of the tallest building on Park Avenue, was a monument to corporate power. Glass walls offered a panoramic view of Chicago, while the massive black marble table reflected the tense expressions of the 12 board members present. Richard, still feeling the physical exhaustion from the previous day, occupied his usual seat at the head of the table. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice firmer than ever, "before anyone else speaks, I would like to present some documents." Edward Miller, seated to his right, tried to intervene. "Richard, we've already prepared a press release. We just need your approval to—" "No, Edward," Richard cut him off, spreading folders across the table. "First, you're going to see this. These are the original documents of the New Horizon project, including the social impact reports that were deliberately ignored." A murmur of discomfort swept through the room. Albert Fernandez, the most senior board member, cleared his throat before speaking. "Richard, that acquisition was completely legal. All procedures were followed." "Legal doesn't mean ethical, Albert," Richard replied, projecting a series of photographs onto the screen. "These are the families our legal procedure left without hope. And this," he continued, switching to the next image, "is what we did with the land. Absolutely nothing. Millions in real estate speculation while people live in precarious conditions." On the other side of the city, at that very moment, Emily and Sophia were in Amanda's small apartment, helping her respond to the hundreds of messages flooding in through social media. The video they had produced had become a catalyst for other, similar stories. "Look at this," said Amanda, showing her laptop. "People from all over the country are sharing similar cases. There are dozens of abandoned housing projects, entire communities affected." Emily, who was typing frantically on her phone, looked up. "The hashtag Damen New Horizon project is already trending, and there are journalists who want to talk to us." Back in the boardroom, the temperature of the meeting was rising. Richard had just revealed that the subsidiary responsible for purchasing the land had been created specifically for this operation, as part of a complex scheme to avoid direct association with Thompson Developments. "This is ridiculous," exploded Francisco Torres, one of the youngest directors. "You're going to destroy years of work because of a moment of conscience?" Richard finished. "Yes, Francisco, that's exactly what I'm doing." Edward, who had remained silent for the past few minutes, slowly stood up. "Richard, you need to understand something. It's not just about this project. If we start reviewing every acquisition, every operation, every irregularity," Richard interrupted. "Every community affected, every life impacted by our decisions." Richard's phone vibrated. It was a message from Sophia. "Dad, Amanda is giving a live interview to a news channel. It's incredible. She's telling everything." Alberto Mendez slammed his hand on the table forcefully. "Enough! Richard, you're emotionally compromised. I suggest you step away from the presidency temporarily until this situation is under control." A heavy silence fell over the room. Richard looked out the window, gazing at the city stretching out to the horizon. Somewhere down there, Joseph Charles Smith was probably continuing his work, keeping the streets clean while the powerful decided the fate of thousands in their glass towers. "It won't be necessary for me to step aside," Richard replied, turning to the board, "because from now on, we're going to do things differently, and anyone unwilling to change can look for another company to work for." Edward Miller paled. "You can't do this. The board forgets that I'm still the majority shareholder," Richard interrupted. "And more importantly, I have evidence of all the irregularities I've uncovered in the last 12 hours, including some that would certainly interest the public prosecutor's office." At that moment, a secretary hurried into the room. "Mr. Thompson, there's a news team in the lobby. They're asking for a statement about the New Horizon project and, well, About all the other similar projects being exposed on social media. Richard stood up, adjusting his tie. Great, I'll go down to speak with them. And gentlemen, he added, turning to the board, I suggest you prepare your own explanations. Because starting today, Thompson Enterprises will operate under a new policy, total transparency. As he walked toward the elevator, Richard received another message, this time from Emily. Dad, Amanda is inspiring everyone. She is showing that a single voice can make a difference. We are proud of you. Her hands trembled slightly as she put her phone in her pocket. She knew she was about to face a storm, but for the first time in her professional life, she felt completely at peace with her decisions. True strength, she had learned, was not in economic power or corporate maneuvers, but in the courage to face one's own choices and their consequences. The next 48 hours turned into a whirlwind of events. The impromptu press conference in the lobby of Thompson Enterprises became the most talked about topic on the news. The image of Richard Thompson, the powerful CEO, publicly admitting his company's mistakes and promising radical changes, went viral instantly. It's surreal, commented Amanda, watching the video of the statement for the 10th time on her phone. She was in her room, surrounded by Emily and Sophia, who had practically moved in over the past few days. Your dad is really changing the game, Emily agreed, not taking her eyes off her laptop. Look at this. There are already over 50 different reports about similar cases across the country. What was supposed to be a local story is turning into a national movement. Have you seen the memes? Laughed Sophia, showing her phone. There's one of your dad dressed as a janitor with the caption, Rich Cleans Too. It already has millions of shares. The light-hearted mood was interrupted by the arrival of Joseph Charles, who looked worried. Girls, I think you need to see this. He turned on the small TV in the room, tuning into a news channel. On the screen, Edward Miller was holding a parallel press conference, surrounded by other board members. It is with great regret that we announce that Mr. Richard Thompson is going through a moment of intense emotional stress. His recent actions and statements are clearly the result of the pressure and trauma from the accident involving his daughters. They're trying to discredit your dad, observed Joseph Charles, his voice filled with concern. They want to make it seem like he's unstable. Emily was already dialing her father's number when her phone rang. It was Richard. Dad, we just saw... I know, sweetheart. Richard's voice sounded tired but determined. But don't worry. I was expecting this. What they don't know is that I have an ace up my sleeve. At that very moment, in a small meeting room at the public ministry, Richard handed a folder full of documents to a prosecutor. These are all the evidence, he explained. Every abandoned project, every affected community, every irregularity over the past 10 years, including the ones I helped cover up. The prosecutor, Dr. Helen Smith, flipped through the documents with growing interest. Do you realize the consequences of this? Not just for your company, but for the entire real estate sector? I do, Richard replied, and that's exactly why I'm here. Back in Spring Garden, Amanda was finishing another video for social media. This time, she had interviewed several residents of the community, each sharing their stories and dreams for the neighborhood. You know what's most amazing, she commented to Emily and Sophia. People aren't just complaining. They're proposing solutions, organizing themselves. The community's WhatsApp group keeps growing. Joseph Charles Smith, who was watching the activity with a mix of pride and apprehension, received an enigmatic message on his phone. I need to talk to you urgently. It's about the original project. I have information that could change everything. The message came from Charles Albert Fernandez, his former boss at the construction company where he had worked as an engineer, the same man who years ago had refused to help him when the project was cancelled. Meanwhile, at the Thompson mansion, Richard was facing a tense meeting with his lawyers. You're exposing yourself too much, argued Dr. Marcos, his lawyer of 2 decades. The minority shareholders are already organizing for a lawsuit. They might try to force you out. Let them try, Richard replied, his voice firm. I've spent too much time worrying about stock value. Now it's time to worry about the value of people. His phone buzzed with a notification. Amanda's latest video had reached 1 million views in less than 2 hours. In the comments, Hundreds of people shared similar stories from their own communities. A new message from Emily appeared on the screen. "Dad, you need to see this. Amanda is getting invitations to speak at universities. And there's a housing rights NGO that wants to partner with her." Richard smiled, feeling a mix of pride and hope. The movement that had started with a simple act of gratitude was turning into something much bigger. The waves of change he had set in motion were growing, and not even the tallest walls of corporate power could contain them. But as he looked out at the city from his office window, Richard knew the real battle was just beginning. Somewhere in that jungle of buildings, his opponents were surely planning their next move, and he needed to be ready for what was coming. The coffee shop downtown was practically empty at that time of the morning. Joseph Charles stared at the cup in front of him, thinking about the strange meeting request he had received from his former boss. Charles Albert Fernandez, now a man, with completely white hair, entered the establishment promptly at 7. "Joseph Charles," he greeted, sitting down with difficulty. "Thank you for coming. I need to clear my conscience before it's too late." On the other side of the city, Richard faced an emergency meeting with the board of shareholders. The room was even more tense than usual, with several unfamiliar faces. Lawyers and consultants hastily hired by the board members. "The numbers are clear," a financial consultant presented. "The company's stock has dropped 15% since the start of this situation. The investors are nervous, and with good reason." Edward Miller, who looked like he hadn't slept in days, intervened. "Richard, be reasonable. We can turn this into a major marketing campaign. We announce a social responsibility program, make a few donations, and—" "Enough with the cover-ups," Richard cut him off. "I want to know who authorized the purchase of the land for the New Horizon project. The final signature is mine, yes, but someone orchestrated the entire operation, and I want to know who it was." A heavy silence fell over the room. Edward visibly paled. Meanwhile, at the downtown cafe, Charles Albert continued his revelation to Joseph Charles Smith. "The project wasn't just shelved," he explained, his voice trembling. "It was sabotaged. Someone inside Thompson Developments created an entire operation to make New Horizon unviable. It wasn't just about the land, it was to prevent the project from becoming a model that others could follow." Joseph Charles felt his heart race. Why? Because a truly social, successful housing project would threaten an entire business model based on real estate speculation. And it wasn't just Thompson Developments. There were other interests involved, politicians, business people. At the Thompson mansion, Emily, Sophia, and Amanda were organizing a live broadcast on social media. Amanda's room had been transformed into a small production studio. "Today, we're going to show the original documents for the project," Amanda explained to the camera. "I want everyone to see how it was conceived, how much care went into every detail." Emily, who was monitoring the live comments, widened her eyes. "Amanda, there's a comment here. It's from a former alderman. He claims to have proof that the project was deliberately sabotaged." At the cafe, Charles Albert pulled a flash drive from his pocket. "Here's everything. Emails, recorded meetings, documents that prove the conspiracy. I kept all this for years out of fear, but I can't carry this weight anymore." Joseph Charles Smith's phone buzzed with a message from Richard. "We need to talk. Urgently. I've discovered something serious about Edward Miller." In the boardroom, Richard continued his confrontation. "Gentlemen, I've just received information that changes everything. Edward, would you like to explain why your name appears in documents from an offshore company that received millions right after the purchase of the New Horizon land?" Edward stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "This is absurd. You can't prove anything." "Actually, I can," replied Richard, opening his laptop. "And it's not just about New Horizon. I'm talking about an entire decade of similar operations." In Spring Garden, Amanda's live broadcast had turned into a phenomenon. Thousands of people watched as she showed the original plans, explaining every technical detail her father had developed. "And here," she pointed to a detailed blueprint, "see how the project even included a rehabilitation center. This could have changed the lives of so many people like me." Her voice faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. Emily and Sophia by her side squeezed her hands in support. Back at the cafe, Joseph Charles examined the documents on the flash drive through his phone. Each new revelation made his heart sink further. Years of his life, the dream of so many families, everything had been destroyed by a scheme much larger than he had imagined. "Why are you showing me this now?" he asked Charles Albert. The former boss smiled sadly. "Because your daughters," he pointed to the live broadcast playing on a TV in the cafe, "are doing what we should have done years ago, fighting for the truth." Joseph Charles Smith stood up, determined. "I need to take this to Richard Thompson immediately, and then we'll make everything public." "Be careful," warned Charles Albert Fernandez. "These people, they won't give up easily." As he hurriedly walked to the subway, Joseph Charles received another message, this time from Amanda. "Dad, you need to see this. People are organizing. They're planning a peaceful protest in front of Thompson Enterprises tomorrow. Thousands have already confirmed they'll be there." The morning sun was already high in the Chicago sky, illuminating a city that seemed to be awakening not just to another day, but to a new awareness. The truth, buried for so long under layers of concrete and bureaucracy, was finally beginning to surface. The morning dawned differently in Chicago. Thousands of people converged on Park Avenue, carrying signs and banners with slogans like "Housing is a right" and "A new horizon for all." The protest, organized through social media, had grown far beyond initial expectations. Amanda, in her wheelchair, was at the center of it all, surrounded by Emily and Sophia. Her voice, amplified by a microphone, echoed down the avenue. "We're not just here for the New Horizon project. We're here for all the communities that have been ignored, for all the dreams that have been shelved." On the 40th floor of the Thompson Enterprises building, Richard watched the crowd forming. Below, Joseph Charles had just arrived, carrying the flash drive with the evidence provided by Charles Albert. "This is much bigger than we imagined," said Joseph Charles, connecting the device to Richard's computer. "It wasn't just one project. That was sabotaged. It was an entire model of social development that threatened certain interests." Richard watched the evidence with a mix of horror and outrage. Emails, meeting recordings, bank transfers, everything pointed to a systematic conspiracy led by Edward Miller and other top-tier executives. "Look at this," Joseph Charles pointed to a specific document. "Edward created a network of shell companies to buy land intended for social projects across the country. Then he left everything on hold, waiting for appreciation. At that moment, the office door swung open abruptly. Edward entered, accompanied by 2 security guards. "Richard, this has to stop now. You have no idea what's at stake." "No, Edward," replied Richard, his voice calm but firm. "You're the one who has no idea. Mary," he called to his secretary, "please ask Dr. Helen Smith to come up. She's waiting in the lobby." Edward paled upon hearing the prosecutor's name. "You can't do this. Think about the jobs, the economy." "Think about the lives," interrupted Joseph Charles, standing up. "The families you destroyed with your greed." Down below, the protest was gaining momentum. Amanda had started broadcasting live, showing thousands of followers the original documents of the project. Her voice, choked with emotion, touched hearts. "Look at what could have been. A place where people with disabilities like me would have access to treatment, where children would have quality schools, where families would have dignity." Emily and Sophia, by her side, were coordinating an improvised team of young people, helping to organize the protest. "It's incredible," Emily commented, "how it all started with an act of kindness from your father, and now it's a movement," Sophia added, hugging Amanda, "and there's no turning back." In the office, Dr. Helen Smith was examining the evidence with professional attention. "This is very serious, gentlemen. We're talking about a sophisticated criminal organization operating within the real estate market." Edward, cornered, tried one last move. "Richard, think carefully. I can make a deposit right now, 50 million, 100 million, for a social fund, however you want it." "It's not about money anymore, Edward," Richard replied. "In fact, it never was." Joseph Charles Smith's phone buzzed with a message from Amanda. "Dad, you need to see this. People are sharing stories from all over the country. There are hundreds of similar cases." Dr. Helen Smith was already on the phone, mobilizing her team. I'll need protection for all the witnesses, and freeze all accounts related to these companies immediately." Richard walked to the window, observing the crowd that now filled several blocks. Among the people, he saw entire families, elders, young people, all united by a cause that, until a few days ago, he himself had ignored. "You know, Edward," he said without turning around, "I spent my whole life building taller and taller buildings without realizing that I was, in fact, building walls. Walls between people, between realities. It's time to tear down those walls." At that moment, a deafening chorus rose from the street, thousands of voices singing together, demanding justice and transformation. Amanda had started reading in her live broadcast excerpts from the documents that proved the conspiracy. "You don't understand," Edward murmured, sinking into a chair. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. It was just business." "No, Joseph," Charles replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "It was people's lives, and it still is." The morning advanced over Chicago, and with it, a new story began to be written, not just in the news or on social media, but in the heart of every person, who now understood that real change begins when someone decides to do the right thing no matter the cost. A week after the revelations that shook the Brazilian real estate market, the old boardroom of Thompson Incorporations had transformed into an unlikely operations center, where executives in expensive suits once discussed profit margins. Community leaders, social architects, and residents of Spring Garden now planned the future together. "The original project was good," explained Joseph Charles Smith, now reinstated in his role as an engineer, pointing to the blueprints spread across the table. "But we can do even better." Amanda brought up important suggestions about accessibility that we hadn't considered at the time. Richard, who had just returned from a meeting with the public prosecutor's office, observed the scene with a mix of pride and apprehension. The past few weeks had been intense. Edward and other executives were under investigation. The company's stock was fluctuating on the market, and the press showed no mercy. "Dad," called Emily, entering the room with her laptop, "I need to show you something. The crowdfunding campaign we launched for the rehabilitation center has already reached 3 times the initial goal." Amanda, who was participating in the meeting via video call from her room, smiled on the computer screen. "And it's not just money. We have doctors, physical therapists, and other professionals offering to work voluntarily on the project." Sophia, who had surprisingly developed a talent for community relations, added, "And the stories keep coming. People from all over the country want to replicate the model we're developing here." Richard sat heavily in a chair, feeling the weight of responsibility. "The challenge now is to make all of this work within the law, sustainably. We can't disappoint all these people. That's why we're here," said a firm voice from the door. It was Dr. Teresa Fields, a renowned urban planner who had voluntarily joined the project. "What you're doing here is revolutionary. You're proving that it's possible to do real estate development with social responsibility." In the Spring Garden community, the changes were already beginning to show. A cleanup effort had transformed the abandoned lot into a temporary community space. Children played where there had once been only weeds and rubble. "See that lady? Over there." Joseph Charles pointed to a resident who was coordinating a group of young people in the community garden. "She lived here when it all began, 15 years ago. She never lost hope." Richard watched the activity through his car window, remembering how it all started. "You know, Joseph Charles, I still wonder, why did you choose to bring me here that day? You could have just taken the money." Joseph Charles smiled, that serene smile everyone now knew so well. "Because I saw something in your eyes when you hugged your daughters after the accident. I saw a man who, despite all his power and money, still knew what truly mattered." In the makeshift office they had set up in the community, Amanda was hosting another one of her live broadcasts. Her audience kept growing and now included architecture and urban planning students from across the country. "The most important thing," she explained, showing the new projects, "is that every decision is being made together with the community. There's no longer someone from above deciding what's best for those who live here." Emily, who was following the comments, interrupted. "Amanda, there's an interesting message here. A developer from Porto Alegre wants to learn about the project. They say they're willing to rethink their developments following our model. That's how change happens, commented Sophia, who had just arrived with coffee for everyone. One person inspires another who inspires another. Richard, watching his daughters working side by side with Amanda, felt a different emotion. It was no longer the weight of guilt or the fear of consequences. It was the certainty that, even with all the challenges ahead, they were on the right path. "Mr. Richard," called one of the community's oldest residents, Mr. John, who approached timidly. "Can I make a suggestion for the project?" "Of course, Mr. John, all ideas are welcome. We could use that space near the entrance to build a community library. You know, to encourage the kids to study, like Amanda," Richard smiled, remembering how many times he had ignored suggestions in board meetings. "Excellent idea, John. Why don't you join us at the next planning meeting?" The sun was beginning to set over Spring Garden, casting long shadows over the land that was gradually becoming a place of hope again. In the old boardroom, now transformed into a participatory planning center, the work continued. The transformation was just beginning, and every small step was a victory shared by all. 3 months had passed since the big revelations. Spring Garden had turned into a massive construction site, but unlike any other the city had ever seen. Among the colorful graffiti-covered barriers made by the community, dozens of professionals and residents worked together, each contributing in their own way to the rebuilding of a collective dream. Amanda, now the coordinator of the social project at the new Thompson Incorporations, was leading a meeting in the temporary community center. Her motorized wheelchair, a joint gift from Emily and Sophia, allowed her to move easily between the work tables. "The rehabilitation center is almost ready," she explained, showing the latest photos on the projector screen. "We already have a full team of volunteer professionals, and the internship program for physical therapy students starts next month." Richard, sitting at the back of the room, watched proudly as his old meeting room had been transformed. Where there once stood an imposing mahogany table, now several smaller tables formed work groups, each focused on a different aspect of the project. "The changes don't stop there," Amanda continued, moving to the next slide. "The professional training program has already graduated its first class. 15 community residents are now employed on site, and another 30 are in training." Joseph Charles, now the director of social projects for the company, added, "And most importantly, everything is being documented and turned into a replicable model. We already have 3 other developers interested in implementing similar projects in their regions." Emily, who had taken on the responsibility for the project's communication, raised her hand. "And there's more news. The documentary we're producing about the transformation of Spring Garden has been selected for an international social film festival." Sophia, who had surprisingly discovered a passion for social architecture, presented the latest changes to the project. "We've managed to integrate more green spaces and communal areas, exactly as the community suggested in the assemblies." During the meeting break, Richard walked to the window, observing the activity below. Groups of children were leaving the temporary school set up in colorful containers, while elderly residents tended to the community garden that was already producing a good portion of the vegetables consumed in the neighborhood. "Thinking about how much we've changed?" asked Joseph Charles, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. "In how I've changed," corrected Richard. "You know, the other day I found an old photo from when I took over as president of the company. I looked like a different person." "And you were," replied Joseph Charles. That Richard wouldn't have stopped a car in the rain to help someone. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the entrance of the community center. A group of journalists had arrived for a scheduled press conference. Among them was a team from a major international newspaper. "Everyone ready?" asked Amanda, positioning herself in front of the microphones. Beside her, Emily and Sophia were putting the final touches on the presentation. The story of Spring Garden had become a case study in universities across the country. The participatory development model, where the community had an active voice in all decisions, was redefining the standards of the construction industry. "The secret," Amanda explained to the journalists, "is that we're not just building houses, we're rebuilding an entire community, restoring people's dignity." Richard, observing his old meeting room now full of life and purpose, grabbed his phone to show something to Joseph Charles. It was a message from Dr. Helen Smith. First sentence handed down today, Edward Miller and 3 other executives convicted. But most importantly, the judge ruled that all recovered funds be allocated to social projects similar to Spring Garden. Joseph Charles smiled. That serene smile everyone now knew so well. You know what's most amazing? All of this started with a simple act of kindness on a rainy day. Outside, the sun began to set over Spring Garden, painting the sky with shades of orange that reflected off the windows of the new buildings under construction. Buildings that, unlike the old projects of Thompson Developments, weren't just structures of concrete and steel, but symbols of a much deeper transformation. "Dad," called Emily, approaching with her tablet. "You need to see this. Amanda is getting messages from people all over the world. There are people who want to learn about the project, to gain from our experience." Richard embraced his daughter, feeling an emotion that words could not describe. In just a few months, his life had completely changed. He had lost part of his fortune, it was true, but he had gained something far more valuable, the certainty that he was finally doing the right thing. Night fell over Chicago, but in Spring Garden the lights remained on. At the community center, residents gathered for another meeting. In the temporary school, volunteer teachers offered evening classes. At the future rehabilitation center, workers put in overtime to meet the deadline. A new life was blossoming, not just for Richard and his family, but for an entire community that was finally beginning to see their dreams turn into reality. The sun rose over Spring Garden on a special day. After a year of intense work, the key, new housing complex was ready for its inauguration. The streets, now paved and tree-lined, were decorated with colorful banners. The community center, the beating heart of the neighborhood, overflowed with people arriving for the celebration. Amanda, elegantly dressed, adjusted the microphone on her wheelchair. As the executive director of the newly created New Horizon Foundation, she would be the first to speak at the ceremony. Beside her, Emily finalized the last checks for the live broadcast, while Sophia coordinated the team of photographers and videographers. "Nervous?" asked Joseph Charles, approaching his daughter with his characteristic calm smile. "A little," admitted Amanda, "but it's a good kind of nervousness. Look at how many people came. There are people from all over the country, Dad." Indeed, the event had attracted national attention. Representatives from other cities, real estate developers, social activists, and authorities filled the space. Among them was Dr. Helen Smith, who was chatting animatedly with Richard near the stage. "The numbers are impressive," commented the prosecutor. 15 developers have already adopted the New Horizon model in their projects, and the complaints we received led to the review of over 50 problematic developments across the country. Richard observed the activity with a mix of pride and humility. Thompson Incorporations had completely changed its way of operating. Although profits were lower, the company had never been so healthy and respected. "Mr. Richard," called Mrs. Zephyr, one of the oldest residents of the community, "I wanted to show you something." She handed him an old photo, yellowed with time. It showed her family in front of the old shack where they used to live. "I kept it to never forget where we came from, and to remind myself that dreams may take time, but they do come true." The sound of music caught everyone's attention. The neighborhood children's choir, directed by Sophia in yet another of her surprising talent discoveries, began the performance that would open the ceremony. "Attention, everyone," Emily called through the microphone. "We'll start in 5 minutes." Joseph Charles took this moment to hand something to Richard. It was the old photo from the day the New Horizon project was first presented, so many years ago. "I kept this to give to you today," he explained, "to show that sometimes we need to lose one dream to achieve an even greater one." The ceremony began with Amanda at the microphone. A year ago, this place was a symbol of abandoned dreams. Today, it is proof that when we join forces, when we give people a voice and dignity, the impossible becomes possible. The cameras panned across the housing complex, showing the colorful buildings with their community gardens on the terraces, the rehabilitation center equipped with cutting-edge technology, the school that was already a benchmark for holistic education, and the social business incubator helping residents develop their own ventures. "But the most important thing," Amanda continued, isn't the buildings or the facilities, it's the community we've built. Every person here is part of this story. Each one has contributed with their talent, their strength, their hope. Emily and Sophia, now standing beside their father, held his hands tightly. The 3 generations of the Thompson family had been transformed by this journey. Richard was no longer just the powerful businessman, but a man who had rediscovered his humanity. His daughters had found purpose and meaning far beyond the privileges they were raised in. After the official speeches, as people wandered through the complex on guided tours, Richard found a moment of quiet in the rooftop garden of the community center. From there he could see the full scope of the project, not just the buildings, but the life pulsating on every corner. "You know what's most incredible?" said Joseph Charles, joining him. "All of this started with a simple no." Richard smiled, remembering that rainy day that had changed his life. "When you turned down the money, and when you accepted the challenge," Joseph Charles added. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the simplest choices." In the main hall, Amanda was leading a video conference with representatives from other cities interested in the project. Emily was documenting everything for the Foundation's historical archive, while Sophia rehearsed with a new group of young people for the upcoming cultural performance. Night fell over Spring Garden, but the lights remained on, not just the street lights and building lights, but especially the ones shining in the eyes of every person who now had a true home. "Dad," Amanda called, approaching Joseph Charles with tears in her eyes, "I just got the news. The New Horizon model has been selected as the national public policy for social housing." The words hung in the air like a blessing. The dream of an engineer, transformed by the courage of a businessman and the activism of 3 young women, had become a quiet revolution now spreading across the country. Richard looked one last time at the old photo Joseph Charles had given him. In it, dreams had been sketched on paper. Now looking out the window, he saw those dreams multiplied into reality. Not just in concrete and steel, but in the smile of every resident, in the dignity of every family, in the hope of every child who now had a true home. Spring Garden had become more than a housing project. It was a beacon of hope, a reminder that when we choose to do the right thing, even if belatedly, we can transform not just a neighborhood or a city, but the future of entire generations.